What is it that makes a person take a cab rather than take public transit? For me, it's if at the other end of a subway ride, I have to walk 20 minutes to my final destination. It seems silly to call a cab from the end of the subway ride, especially if the subway ride is, say, only a mile or so. In this case, I might as well take a cab from home. There seems to be a gap, a missing option between the subway ride and your final destination. So let's do a thought experiment. What if, just what if, New York had a pedicab industry? I'm not talking about the pedicabs you see at Times Square, where it's completely for tourists, limited only to a tiny portion of the whole of New York City. I'm talking about an industry that will take people on that last mile journey, wherever they may be in New York. So here's the problem with not just New York, but some other places that have mass public transit. Sure, mass transit like a bus or train can take you through great distances which make up the majority of your trip, but these only go from station to station. What about that last leg, which is about a mile or a 20-minute walk? You could say that a city bike can turn that 20-minute walk into a 7-minute bike ride. Even if bikes are available, people might not want to ride a bike, or they can't ride a bike, or they're carrying too many things, or it's too hot, or it's raining, or they're just simply not dressed for it. So let's talk more about this thought experiment in New York. And I'm interrupting this video because I have an exciting announcement to make. So please stay till the very end of this video because I have some big news to share regarding Urban Caffeine. This idea of a pedicab industry struck me when I was in Montreal and saw this pedicab on an open street. At first I thought these are rides for hire where you can pay a pedicab and they'll take you to where you need to be. You have to note, open streets in Montreal are long. The longest pedestrianized street is about 1.5 miles. That's a long stretch, and so if you're tired, it's hot, and you're carrying a bunch of stuff, the option for a pedicab would be nice. But it turns out these pedicabs are not for hire and are offered as a free pedicab services for seniors. When I was told this, my jaw dropped, and I was thinking, wow, what a progressive society. I thought they were pedicabs for hire because other countries have these micromobility services that function as mini taxis. In Thailand, you have Tuktuks. In Vietnam, there are Cyclos. And in the Philippines, there are Tricycles. People would take these mini taxis to cover distances that are far enough that are kind of uncomfortable to walk, but they're out of the way for trains and buses. Especially when someone's carrying groceries, or it's raining, or they just cannot physically walk very far. These distances are usually about 1 mile to 1.5 miles. Automobile taxis are also available in these countries, but since the overhead of owning a car is high, taxi fare is high too. So it's very popular to use these alternatives, which are mini taxis. Besides, a taxi stand takes up so much space. Compare it to a tuk-tuk dispatch. I mean, look at all that compactness. You can park so many in less space. And this type of micromobility is an entire industry. There are drivers' associations in some places, and all these mini taxis need to be registered with the government like an automobile. So you often see these with license plates. Don't get me wrong, there is a time and place for using a cab, which I talked about in this video that covers the car optional life. But if you just want to carry 3 grocery bags for 5 blocks, I don't really have much option but to walk. I'm not much of a bike rider, and for micro trips like these, it would be silly to call a cab. Taxis are just like cars that take up so much of the street and road, guzzle a lot of gas, and the overhead is very expensive. It's estimated that the average cost of a private vehicle per year is $10,000 to $15,000. And that's a private vehicle. A cab would be even more expensive because of the high maintenance, just because it's being used so often. And is it just me, or have you also noticed that cars have grown in size over the last 5 to 10 years? In the last 10 years, cars have increased by 1 foot in width and almost 2 feet in length. This last summer, I visited a friend in California and they picked me up in this older model of a Prius. And I remember riding a Prius when it first came out. I thought that car was so spacious inside, but then getting into this Prius today, it felt so small. And that's when it struck me that I've gotten used to larger cars because the only times I've ever been in a car is with a taxi or Uber or Lyft. And these tend to be newer vehicles. And they're always very spacious. And you know what's even more interesting? It's not just cars. I mentioned this on Patreon. I went to a farm this summer as well. And yes, that's me riding a tractor. What I noticed in this small town are that the roads were very new, and I was told they're constantly being repaved and redone because the farm equipment has gotten bigger over the last few years as well. So the roads cannot handle them, and so there's this constant upkeep on maintaining the roads. Everything is getting bigger, and we need to scale things down to appropriate human sizes. For the space of 3 taxis, you can have 10 pedicabs. And bikes and pedicabs are not as rough on the road compared to taxis. So we wouldn't be fixing roads so often because there wouldn't be as much wear and tear on the streets from a 2 to 5 ton car. But more important to note is the safety we get with more bikes on the streets. The more bikes there are on the street, the more people feel safe riding one, which encourages even more biking. Plus, bikes and pedicabs are less prone to collide with each other, unlike cars. So less accidents and more convenience. Electric bikes can be powerful and can definitely haul a rickshaw. However, the city is still dealing with issues on the hazards of batteries on bikes. There have been hundreds of fires and several deaths because these unregulated batteries can explode while charging when they get too hot. So, if we do have a pedicab industry, we need strict regulations on the use of batteries to make sure everybody uses certified batteries that fit safety standards, and we implement good practices when it comes to charging batteries. And what about pricing? The tourist pedicabs at Times Square charge anywhere from $3 to $7 per minute. So that equates to an average of $150 for about half an hour ride. For an everyday journey like going from one end of the neighborhood to another, I don't think $3 to $7 per minute is a fair price. What do you think a pedicab should cost for a neighborhood ride? The thing with tourist pedicabs is they are for tourists, meaning they are going to be marked up. One, because they're for tourists and tourists will pay that. And two, these pedicabs don't consistently have a rider. So the high markup kind of makes up for the times that they don't have a customer, their downtime. So my theory is that if there's high demand for pedicabs for everyday rides within the neighborhoods, pedicabs could constantly have passengers, which will drive down the costs, and prices will become reasonable. I like the idea of having these micromobility options that cover distances that are only about half a mile to a mile and a half. Yes, there is city bike, but like I said, not everybody can bike or prefers to bike. But this pedicab industry idea is just a concept I'm throwing out into the world. After all, ideas are a dime a dozen. Of course, an electrified pedicab industry is not going to happen anytime soon in New York. New York is just barely learning to share the streets and roads with bikes. How are we going to share it with this rickshaw pulling e-bike? And we will need a lot of laws and regulations and figure out how licensing works, maybe even put up an entire department for micro-taxis. It's a lot of logistical and infrastructural hurdles that we'd have to go through when in reality, New York has bigger problems to deal with its current infrastructure. Seriously, flooding in the subway is a way bigger problem than me trying to figure out how to carry my groceries for 5 blocks. But having said all this, the bike culture in New York is getting better, with newer lanes, road diets, and more people advocating for bike rider and pedestrian safety. The more progress we gain, the closer we are to a future of safer and convenient streets. I know we are nowhere near where places like Amsterdam is today, But progress is progress. For now, I'm just going to enjoy the thought of a pedicab industry in New York. In other news, I'm busy putting together this merch store, and if I don't launch it before this video publishes, definitely after this video publishes. What's taking me so long is just quality control. I have this shirt that is probably 12 years old, has survived well over 600 washes, and to this day, it's still wearable. And so I hunted down this brand and the blend of the fabric, and I found a quality silk screening shop. And so I got the materials, I got the service. So I'm ready to launch a merch shop. And the exciting news is that the store has been up and running. I did a soft launch this last week to Patreon members and YouTube members. Everything in the shop has been designed by me, so these are all original designs that you'll find nowhere else. It really did take some painful weeks to source down materials, find reputable vendors, and put up the shop, because I do want you to enjoy the merch for years to come. Patreon and YouTube members will always get 15% off as long as you're a member of Urban Caffeine, and I will post a coupon code for you at the beginning of every month. Just check that out in the private channels. And for everybody else, please enjoy this 10% off this month with the code Open Sesame. Again, I'm so excited to be providing quality merch for those that love cities and public transit. So check out that store at shop.urbancaffeine.com. Thank you for watching, and until the next video, happy New Yorking.